traditional semester, usually it's all MA students in the stats department, so the competition is a little bit different. I'm going to let you guys do exam corrections if you really want to, but you can't get full credit back on the exam. Does that make sense? So you could get a maximum of 1/2 of the points that you missed. Is that clear? It's a little confusing because there's 105 points on the exam. Because the extra credit. So if you got a 50% on the exam, then you could get 50% plus 2.5% of you could get 50% of 50% plus a little bit less over. Does that make sense? So you can't get a perfect score if you didn't get a perfect score already.
So what is correction for? Just calculating reason what?
Say that one more time.
So what does correction mean?
It means you can open the R&D file and just resolve the exam if you want to, and you can turn it in. It's open right now, so you have plenty of time. This shouldn't take you the whole Friday, assuming. So that's like an 1.5 hour exam, but if you really need the time, you're welcome to do that, okay?
So you are moving homework 3 back?
I just updated that an hour ago. Homework 3 and lab 5 will be due Thursday, and I'll have a new set of labs and homeworks probably posted before Thursday, but we can focus on those 2 topics for now. Are there questions about that?
When's the exam correction?
Friday. Yeah. It's by midnight. Yeah. And it's kind of, you can treat that like a homework. Does that make sense? Even though it's an exam, but does the adjustment make sense? Does that make it okay?
So is key posted yet? The key of the exam.
Well, I can't post the key if you're going to be correct.
Oh.
This is getting trouble. I'll post it after Friday. Yeah. All right. So that's the first announcement. I'll have office hours on Thursday, and I will not be available Friday for help because I'm actually moving to another apartment, so I'll be moving boxes. All right, let's remind you what we were talking about last class. And I think the best way to motivate this K&N problem is just with a nice picture. So remember there was a classification setting for supervised learning, and then there was a regression setting for supervised learning. We constructed a function that successfully classified, well, not successfully the market data, but it did the algorithm correctly. And again, points that people were having a hard time understanding is the test point itself comes from the test data, and that's the little cross. And then you just radially move outwards until you capture a neighborhood of points. We use Euclidean distance, which makes sense. And here, you just look at majority wins. And remember, the whole notion of classification, basically, unless we're doing more sophisticated techniques like support vector machines, is it's an estimate of the Bayes classifier, which essentially is a conditional probability given features of the data set. Okay. So just kind of to tie those ideas together, the whole point is you want to estimate y given x equals x, right? Or this can be a set of features, right? This is, y could be disease, no disease, smoker, not smoker, whatever it is, cancer, no cancer. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. So I'm going to briefly discuss the slides from yesterday that I told you were recommended. I had a few questions over what you should know from these slides. I guess I took these from a different course, but I don't think it's out of the scope of this class to understand how a K&N regression works, because it's a very useful extension on K&N classification. And let me just mention this briefly. This has a nice little review of what supervised, unsupervised learning is, etc. We don't have to worry about some of the mathematics here. Parametric, non-parametric. This is a nice little summary right here. I drew this on the board. It's 30 on the set of yesterday's slides. This summarizes, in a very basic sense, some of the fundamental models you would use for supervised and unsupervised learning. Obviously, this chart can be extended, great, but it's nice because in a supervised setting, you have parametric and non-parametric techniques. For regression, we can do least squares, we can do maximum likelihood estimation, that's what MLE is. For classification, the parametric approach is logistic, which is very commonly applied. Non-parametric, the first tool in the toolbox is going to be KNN. You can do that for both regression or categorical data. And then for unsupervised, dimension reduction would make sense for continuous data. That's a principal component analysis. And then clustering, there's different clustering techniques, but the most natural approach is a k-means clustering. I don't know if you guys know some other ones off the top of your head, like Gaussian mixture models. Anyway, you can combine some of these. This gives you a surface level summary of some of that. But let me show you a fun example of k-means regression. And this is the definition. And you can gloss over this, but remember before we looked at the average of it's the values that are on in your indicator function essentially. So here you're just averaging the response. Does that make sense? So if you don't quite have a solid understanding of what the goal is, we're doing regression and we're averaging the y's in a neighborhood of our features. That's all k-means is in a regression sense. Okay. So let's look at an example of k-means regression. And this is a congressional approval example. And the reason I like this example is because it's not a line at all. Does that make sense? So it makes no sense to fit some kind of parametric linear function to this model or to this data set. But if you do a k-means regression and tweak the actual neighborhood, you can see some different shapes. So it shows the. I'm just curious, you guys, what do you think the k value is? One. Yeah. Why is that? Because it's my bad. Does it say that?
Oh, it does say one.
Let's just. I didn't see that. Yeah. It crosses every point. Does that make sense? So this is overfitting. Okay. Okay. So if we used k-means on a test data set, or my bad, this is 5. I didn't. That is 6 minutes ago. This is what it looks like if you have 5 nearest neighbors. So you're kind of seeing that it's capturing the average trend of the data a little bit better. Okay. So you're going to make potentially better predictions. Sure.
How do we know whether it's one or?
Well, if you didn't look at the first line up, then the way a k-means is constructed is it looks at a neighborhood in X. So specifically, it looks at a neighborhood of one case, and it predicts Y using the average of Y. So when you only have one Y value, the average is itself. So in other words, it's going to cross every single point. And this is a very poor model because it's not capturing the overall trend very well.
So basically, why counting the circles between the years?
Well, yeah, like if you can still perform predictions, like maybe on a half-year basis or something like that, using this model. Because you can see, for example, we can predict this value. It doesn't have a dot. Does that make sense? But it's really erratic over here. So your predictions are going to be really off. Does that because you overfit the model? But what you can see is as you increase the neighborhood, it starts to capture more of, I guess you would call the trend of the data as opposed to the noise. Does that make sense? And you can keep increasing the k size, and it's kind of a subjective notion of how what to choose k. You choose the best test error, essentially the lowest test error. So this is a 50 KNN. Notice that we're not doing as good of a job as we were with 10. Okay. So this is kind of fun because the code for this actually is exactly almost exactly the same as the classification, except instead of picking the highest frequency in our table, we just pick the average. That's it, right? It's such an elegant procedure. So you still use the order function. You go 1 to k. That's why I like showing you this code. It's exactly the same idea. So this is posted as a script file in the canvas module. Okay. Now, just for fun, let me show you one more document that I posted. And this one, I'm going to promise you're not going to ever have to actually reproduce this, but it might be a good reference for a future class. So I was bored 6 months ago and I put this up. What this represents is a 2-feature k-means regression. And let me just knit this file so you can get some output. So I hope this makes sense. This is not just confusing you guys. You can gloss over the code. But essentially, this is the true function where I simulated the data. Does that make sense? So remember, in any statistical model, it's y equals f of x, in this case f of x1, f of x2, plus epsilon. Does that make sense? So your actual curve exists in 3 dimensions, right? This is x1, x2, this is y. But the curve itself, that's like the true average, right? So the data is going to be dispersed about this curve. So the data is just going to be random deviations up and down from this curve, okay? But if you can actually assume you know the true parametric form, then we can estimate the form. And it's pretty cool because when you do it, you get pretty close, right? That's a k-means regression. And you can see that it is capturing some of the shape based on the data. Does that make sense? So it's just fun. All right.
Is this code online?
Say that one more time.
Is this code online?
I couldn't hear you. I apologize.
Is this code? Is this our code online?
I put it under the module from yesterday's lecture.
Okay.
So if you want to grab it, it's a markdown file already. And there's no data set because I just simulated the data set. So. Okay. All right. So anyway, that was a quick summary of k-means. And today we're going to deviate. And it seems like a kind of a silly way to teach this material, but I just kept it consistent with the class fall. We're going to go back to graphics. So it's not going to be machine learning topics at the moment. We're going to teach ggplot today, just general notions of graphics. It'll be a little bit more lax. Okay. So this is not going to be a huge focus. This is just a quick recap of base R graphics. Because here's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at base R graphics for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to go ahead and do ggplot. Before doing ggplot, we're going to discuss, things you shouldn't do in graphics and things that we like. Okay. So recall that visualization and variation. You're trying to look at the variation of a variable. If you have a single variable, typically histograms do quantitative measurements, bar plots do categorical measurements. Visualizing covariation, you can just use the plot function to look at scatter plots, and then you can also use multiple box plots to split a continuous measurement up into different levels of categorical variability. So the plot function, I know that you were assessed on the midterm about this, but remember the plot function is the foundation of base R graphics. Essentially, you start with the plot, and then you build on top of that using points, lines, legends. Does that make sense? So you just start with the PLOT and just build after that. You can change the graphical parameters. You can write a loop to build the plot. You have many choices. Okay. So we already did this in class, but this is the whole notion that Diamond's data set. I do recommend I post to the Diamond data set again, but you should already have this in your working directory, so you don't necessarily need to download that file again. But recall, the way you build a plot is you start with plot, and then you can split it up conveniently with different colors based on whatever categorical variable. So at the moment, although we haven't discussed graphics, how many variables are we illustrating in this two-dimensional scatter plot? 3. Does that make sense? So this is because you have
Color.
the carrier, right? Or the quality.
Quality.
Yeah. So you have two quantitative measurements being split by a third variable, and the whole idea is you don't want to create plots where you're adding unnecessary dimensions. You want to do the opposite. You want to try to put more dimensions on a lower dimension instead. Okay. And then once you create the base plot, you can even get more information. Perhaps if you want to look at if there's an interaction between carrot versus the quality, then you can plot separate lines. Does that make sense? If there was not an interaction, or what do we call it in machine learning? Synergy. So silly words for exactly the same thing. But the lines would be parallel if there was not an interaction. Does that make sense? You can see that the lines are not parallel, so there's some kind of interaction. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip this exercise. Let's just go ahead and move on. Okay, so let's do a quick discussion on data visualization in general. And let's talk about what a good visualization is. So in data science, good visualizations should give you more information than you can see in just the data table itself. It's a pretty rough rule of thumb, but if you've created a plot and you're actually not gaining more information from just looking at the data, you haven't really done that much. Does that make sense? So these are a couple famous plots. So John Snow, 1854. This is a plot of the outbreak of cholera in London. And what's cool about this plot is that they originally believed that the disease was airborne, and that's the way you would actually get the disease. But what they did is, I know you could probably find a better picture online, it's a little fuzzy, but if you look at the actual black dots, that's where the outbreaks occurred, or the cases occurred. And it turns out that you see densities of these black dots near water pumps in the city. Okay? So it's pretty cool because that actually helps support the hypothesis that it came from water. Does that make sense? But this is a great plot. What is it? How many dimensions and what type of variables are we looking at? Well, obviously you have 2 spatial dimensions. Okay. So, and you're putting another dimension on like the actual outbreaks. Do you know what I mean? So you're putting a bunch of, and then it showed you very easily some important information regarding this. Okay. Okay, so this next plot, in fact, let me just bring this up on. That's where I get this information from anyway. So this plot, the actual person who created this is famous. So it's Charles Menard, he's a civil engineer, French civil engineer, and he is famous for making like famous plots. I guess they're good plots. This is the map of Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. Okay, let's see this very well. And oops, sorry. What you're seeing here is multiple variables. You're seeing
green button or the green.
Sorry. It's just so hot. So they started the march, okay? And you're getting some type of geographic information, so you're getting spatial variables in this. But what the thick tan or the skin colored represents is the density of troops he started out with. Does that make sense? So you can see that they were losing troops along the way because people were dying across, and then you can even see there's certain landmarks where the troops will actually decrease. And then there was the battle, and then they come back. And when they actually come back, there's like that proportion of troops left over. Does that make sense? And there's a whole bunch of variables being illustrated in this single plot. In fact, let's see if I can point something out. There's some rivers where they crossed. Like here's a river right here, and then you can see there's a decrease in troops. A bunch of them died crossing the river. It's pretty interesting. So let's summarize this plot for a moment. So it shows number of soldiers, right? It shows direction of the march, location coordinates, temperature on the return journey. So you can see temperature is displayed somewhere on here. It's hard to tell, it's just blurred. And location on dates in November and December. So we have, quantitative measurements, spatial coordinates, temperature, dates. Does that make sense? Cool. Pretty cool. All right. Okay, let's talk about some bad plots. This is a little bit more relevant last fall. Close the season, but I just kept it in here. So one thing that people like to do is they like to create Venn diagrams when they're not actually Venn diagrams. Does that make sense? It's just like it has no meaning, right? Mm-hmm. So, yes. So, I mean, you could interpret this a handful of ways. It's almost like 90% of all Americans intersecting with all the gun owners, or 83% of all the gun owners. And then, did you see what I mean? So it really doesn't make any sense, right? But the whole point is there's ways to convey this information a lot better. This is what was attempted to be conveyed, is that if you look at all the people, right? Among all the people, 90%, whether you have a gun or don't have a gun, support universal background checks. And that is not what the law was illustrating. Does that make sense? So this is nice because it actually, it's conveying the point. Okay?
Maybe her plot was still effective because we all know what she meant.
That's probably true.